Before the war made him famous, George S. Patton was already a man who seemed built for conflict. He believed almost obsessively that war was not chaos, it was motion, speed, and relentless pressure. To Patton, hesitation was defeat. He studied ancient commanders like Hannibal and Caesar, convinced that boldness, not caution, won wars. But in an era when many officers still valued careful planning and slow advances, Patton's philosophy felt dangerous, even reckless. He wasn't just a thinker, he was a performer. Polished helmet, ivory-handled pistols, strict discipline. Everything about Patton was designed to project power. To his men, he looked like a warrior from another age. To his peers, he often looked like trouble waiting to happen. And yet, when the United States entered World War II, it was exactly this kind of energy that was desperately needed. In 1942, the Allies faced humiliation in North Africa. American forces were inexperienced, disorganized, and struggling against the seasoned German Afrika Korps. Commanders were cautious, too cautious. The result was hesitation on the battlefield and defeat. That's when Dwight D. Eisenhower made a decision that would define both men's careers. He turned to Patton. Eisenhower was not like Patton. Where Patton was loud, Eisenhower was calm. Where Patton was impulsive, Eisenhower was diplomatic. But Eisenhower understood something critical. This war would not be won by playing it safe. When Patton took command in North Africa after the disaster at Kasserine Pass, the transformation was immediate. Discipline became absolute. Soldiers were ordered to wear proper uniforms at all times. Sloppiness disappeared. Fear was not tolerated. Patton didn't just want a better army, he wanted a different kind of army. And it worked. Under Patton, American forces began to move faster, strike harder, and regain confidence. He pushed his troops relentlessly, often to their limits, but in return he gave them something they hadn't had before: momentum. Eisenhower watched closely. He saw results, real, undeniable results. Patton could take broken units and turn them into an aggressive fighting force in weeks. He could seize initiative where others hesitated. In a war where timing meant everything, Patton was a weapon unlike any other. But there was a problem. Patton didn't just fight the enemy, he fought everyone. He clashed with fellow officers, he ignored conventions, he spoke his mind, often bluntly and publicly. His temper was legendary, and his belief in discipline sometimes crossed a line, from strict to extreme. To Eisenhower, this created a dangerous paradox. Patton was one of his best commanders and one of his biggest risks. Because war wasn't just fought on battlefields, it was fought in headlines, in politics, in alliances, and Patton, with his unpredictability, threatened all of it. Still, Eisenhower kept him close, not because he trusted Patton completely, but because he understood him. He knew that beneath the arrogance and theatrics was something rare, a commander who could act decisively when others froze, a man who believed that victory belonged to those who moved first and fastest. But that same mindset came with consequences. Patton didn't tolerate weakness. He didn't believe in slowing down for the wounded mind. To him, fear was something to overcome, not something to treat. And in the brutal reality of war, that belief would soon lead him into one of the most controversial moments of his career, a moment that could have ended everything. Even in these early days, the warning signs were there: the brilliance, the intensity, the refusal to compromise. Eisenhower saw all of it and made a choice. He would use Patton, but controlling him would be another battle entirely. Because George C. Patton wasn't just a general, he was a force. And forces, once unleashed, don't always follow orders.
In the summer of 1943, as Allied forces pushed through Sicily, victory seemed within reach. But beneath the surface, tension was building. The campaign was brutal. Heat, exhaustion, and constant combat had worn men down physically and mentally. Not every wound was visible. Some soldiers simply couldn't go on. To most commanders, this was an unfortunate reality of war. To George S. Patton, it was something else entirely. He believed that every man had a duty to fight, no matter the cost. Fear, in his eyes, was not an excuse, it was a failure. And in a war where speed and aggression defined success, he had no patience for anything that slowed his army down. That belief collided with reality inside a field hospital. Patton entered the tent expecting to see wounded soldiers, men injured in combat, men who had earned their place there. Instead, he found a young private sitting on a cot, physically unharmed. When asked what was wrong, the soldier admitted he couldn't take it anymore. He was overwhelmed, terrified. Today, we would call it combat stress or PTSD. Patton saw something very different. To him, this wasn't injury, it was weakness. What happened next would shock even his own officers. Patton lashed out, slapping the soldier, shouting at him, accusing him of cowardice. He ordered him back to the front, threatening punishment if he refused. It wasn't an isolated moment. Just days later, it happened again. Another soldier, another breakdown, another explosion of anger from Patton. Word spread quickly through the ranks. Officers were stunned. Medical staff were outraged. This wasn't discipline. This crossed a line. But the real damage came when the story reached the highest level of command, Dwight D. Eisenhower. When Eisenhower learned what Patton had done, his reaction was immediate and personal. He was furious, not just as a commander, but as a leader responsible for the morale and unity of the Allied forces. This wasn't just about one general losing his temper. This was about trust, because soldiers needed to believe that their leaders understood the cost of war, not just physically, but mentally, and Patton had shattered that belief. Eisenhower faced a dilemma that went far beyond simple discipline. On one hand, the facts were undeniable. Patton had abused his authority. If the incident became public, it could damage the reputation of the entire Allied command. Politically, it was explosive. On the other hand, Patton was delivering results. He was one of the few commanders who could maintain offensive momentum. He pushed the army forward when others hesitated. Removing him from command in the middle of a campaign could slow everything down, and in war, hesitation cost lives. Eisenhower had to decide, punish the man or protect the mission. He chose both. Privately, Eisenhower came down hard on Patton. He forced him to apologize to the soldiers, to the medical staff, to everyone involved. The message was clear. This behavior would not be tolerated. But publicly, Eisenhower kept the incident quiet. No court-martial, no removal from command, no public disgrace. To some, it looked like protection. To others, it looked like weakness. But Eisenhower wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about victory. He understood something few others did. Patton was not just a liability. He was also an asset the Allies could not easily replace. And in a war of this scale, losing a commander like him could have consequences far beyond one scandal. Still, the damage lingered. Among the troops, trust had been shaken. Among other officers, doubts began to grow. Was Patton too unstable? Too unpredictable? Could he be relied on when it mattered most? Even Eisenhower had to ask himself that question. Because this wasn't just about what Patton had done. It was about what he might do next. And yet, despite everything, the anger, the controversy, the risk, Eisenhower made a decision that would define their relationship going forward. He would keep Patton in the war, not because he approved of what happened, but because he believed the war could not be won without him. It was a gamble, one that could either secure victory or destroy everything they had built. After the scandal in Sicily,
Many believed George S. Patton's career was over. In another army, in another war, it probably would have been. The incident had crossed a line that commanders were not supposed to cross. Discipline was one thing, humiliation was another. And yet, Patton was still in uniform, still in command, still in the game. But not at the front. For a time, Patton was sidelined, his reputation damaged, his future uncertain. To the outside world, it looked like a quiet demotion, a way to contain the problem without making it public, and in many ways it was. But behind the scenes, Dwight D. Eisenhower was making a very calculated decision. He wasn't asking whether Patton had made a mistake, that was obvious. The real question was far more complicated. Could the Allies afford to lose him? Because by late 1943, the war had reached a critical phase. The next move, the invasion of Western Europe, would require something unprecedented. Coordination on a massive scale, precision timing, absolute aggression once the landing began. And that last part, aggression, was where Patton stood apart. Most generals could plan an operation, many could hold a line, but very few could exploit chaos, turn confusion into momentum, hesitation into collapse. Patton didn't just react to the battlefield, he overwhelmed it. Eisenhower had seen it firsthand, in North Africa, in Sicily. Whenever Patton was unleashed, things moved, fast, sometimes too fast. But in war, speed created opportunities, and opportunities won campaigns. Still, keeping Patton came at a cost. Allied command wasn't just American, it was British, Canadian, Free French, a fragile coalition held together by trust and diplomacy. And Patton, with his sharp tongue and unpredictable behavior, threatened that balance. He had already made controversial remarks about allies. He had a tendency to speak without thinking about political consequences. One wrong statement, one wrong incident, and it could strain relations at the highest level. Eisenhower knew this. He also knew that removing Patton entirely would send another message, that results didn't matter if personality became inconvenient. And in a war where initiative was everything, that kind of message could be just as dangerous. So Eisenhower chose a middle path. He didn't promote Patton publicly. He didn't give him immediate frontline command. Instead, he held him in reserve, close enough to use, controlled enough to manage. To some, it looked like hesitation. In reality, it was strategy. Because Eisenhower wasn't just thinking about the present, he was thinking about what was coming next, the invasion of France. And in that plan, Patton still had a role to play, not just as a battlefield commander, but as something else entirely, a symbol. By this point in the war, even the Germans had formed an opinion about Patton. They saw him as the Allies' most aggressive general, the one most likely to lead a major attack. His reputation had crossed enemy lines, and Eisenhower realized something powerful. That reputation could be used. Patton didn't need to be at the front to influence the war. He just needed to be seen. It was a different kind of weapon, not tanks, not artillery, but perception, fear, expectation. Eisenhower began to understand that Patton's greatest value might not just be in how he fought, but in how the enemy reacted to him. Still, this was a risk, because controlling Patton was never simple. He wanted action, he wanted command, he wanted to prove himself again. Being held back, even temporarily, tested his patience, and a frustrated Patton was just as unpredictable as an unleashed one. Eisenhower had to manage not just a general, but a personality driven by ego, ambition, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. It was a delicate balance. Give him too much freedom and he might create another scandal. Hold him back too long and you risk losing his effectiveness altogether. But Eisenhower stayed the course, because deep down he believed something that few others fully accepted, that George S. Patton,
for all his flaws, was still one of the most dangerous weapons the Allies possessed, not because he was perfect, but because he was unstoppable when pointed in the right direction. The challenge wasn't deciding to use him. The challenge was deciding when. And soon, that moment would come. Not on the battlefield at first, but in one of the greatest deception operations in the history of war.
By early 1944, the war in Europe was approaching its निर्णायक moment. The Allies were preparing for the largest invasion in history, a crossing of the English Channel that would open the road to Nazi-occupied France. Everything depended on surprise. If the Germans knew where the Humla would come, they could concentrate their forces and crush it before it even began. And that's where George S. Patton came back into the picture. Not as a frontline commander, but as a weapon of deception. Even after the controversy in Sicily, one thing had not changed. The Germans feared Patton. To them, he was the Allies' most aggressive general, the one most likely to lead the main Humla. His reputation had grown into something larger than reality, a symbol of speed, violence, and relentless attack. Dwight D. Eisenhower saw an opportunity. If the Germans believed Patton would lead the invasion, then they could be made to believe it would happen somewhere else. This was the foundation of Operation Fortitude, a massive deception plan designed to mislead German intelligence. Fake radio transmissions, inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, an entire phantom army was created on the southeastern coast of England. It was called the 1st U.S. Army Group, and at its center was Patton. To the outside world, it looked like he had been given command of a powerful invasion force preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais, the most direct route into France. German spies reported his movements. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted the fake buildup. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Patton was coming. But it was all an illusion. The real invasion would land in Normandy, far from where the Germans were concentrating their defenses. And as long as they believed Patton was waiting to strike elsewhere, they would hesitate to move their reserves. That hesitation would change everything. For Patton, this role was both crucial and frustrating. He was a man built for action, now asked to stand still and play a part in a grand illusion. No tanks charging forward, no rapid advances, just silence, discipline, and the knowledge that he was being watched, not by his own troops, but by the enemy. It required something different from him: control. And surprisingly, he delivered. Patton maintained the illusion perfectly. He stayed visible, predictable, exactly where the Germans expected him to be. Every move he made reinforced the deception. Every report that reached German command made the fake army seem more real. Eisenhower's gamble was working. When D-Day finally came on June 6, 1944, German High Command hesitated. Even as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, they held back critical divisions. They believed this was just a diversion. The real invasion, led by Patton, was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. Days passed, then weeks, and still they waited. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The Allies had secured their foothold in France. The balance had shifted. Patton had not fired a shot, but he had helped win one of the most important moments of the war. For Eisenhower, this was confirmation of something he had believed all along. Patton was not just a battlefield commander. He was a force multiplier. Even when he wasn't fighting, he influenced the enemy's decisions. His reputation alone could shape strategy, delay reactions, and create openings that no amount of firepower could achieve. But the waiting wouldn't last forever. Once the deception had done its job, Patton would finally be unleashed again, and when he was, the results would be exactly what Eisenhower had counted on:
speed, aggression, and chaos for the enemy. Still, the question remained. Had Patton truly changed, or had he simply been placed in the one role where his unpredictability could be controlled? Because the final test was still ahead, a moment when the war would hang in the balance, and this time there would be no illusions, only action. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe seemed to be turning decisively in the Allies' favor. After the breakout from Normandy, Allied forces had pushed deep into France. Paris was liberated. German armies were retreating. There was a growing belief, quiet but powerful, that the end was near. And then, without warning, everything changed. In December, Hitler launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed was too difficult for a large-scale attack. It was a bold, desperate gamble. German forces punched through thin American lines. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe seemed to be turning decisively in the Allies' favor. After the breakout from Normandy, Allied forces had pushed deep into France. Paris was liberated. German armies were retreating. There was a growing belief, quiet but powerful, that the end was near. And then, without warning, everything changed. In December, Hitler launched a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed was too difficult for a large-scale attack. It was a bold, desperate gamble. German forces punched through thin American lines, creating a deep bulge in the front. Units were overwhelmed, communications collapsed, entire formations were cut off. At the center of the crisis was a small Belgian town, Bastogne. American forces there were surrounded, outnumbered, running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The weather was brutal. Snow, fog, freezing temperatures. Air support was grounded. Reinforcements were nowhere in sight. It was one of the most dangerous moments of the war. Dwight D. Eisenhower needed a response, and fast. But the situation was chaotic. Most commanders were still trying to understand the scale of the German attack. Plans would normally take days to organize. Movements of entire armies required time, coordination, precision. Time the Allies did not have. This is when Eisenhower turned once again to George S. Patton. At the time, Patton's Third Army was advancing east, focused on a completely different objective. Redirecting it would mean halting its current attack, turning thousands of vehicles and moving them north through winter conditions against the flow of a massive enemy offensive. For most commanders, it would have sounded impossible. For Patton, it was already decided. In a high-level meeting, while others were still discussing options, Patton stunned the room. He didn't speak in possibilities, he gave a number. 48 hours. That's how long he said it would take to pivot his entire army and begin the counterattack toward Bastogne. It wasn't a guess. Patton had already anticipated the move. His staff had prepared contingency plans. Routes were mapped. Units were ready to shift direction at a moment's notice. While others reacted, Patton had prepared. Eisenhower didn't hesitate. He gave the order. What followed was one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. In freezing conditions, over congested and icy roads, Patton's forces executed a massive, rapid turn north. Columns of tanks, trucks, and artillery moved day and night. Logistics teams kept fuel and supplies flowing under extreme pressure. And somehow, it worked. Within days, Patton's lead elements reached the outskirts of Bastogne. The encircled American forces, who had been holding on against overwhelming odds, finally saw relief arriving through the snow. The siege was broken. The German advance stalled. The momentum shifted. What had begun as a shocking offensive turned into a costly failure for Germany. Once again, Patton had done exactly what Eisenhower had trusted him to do.
Move fast, strike hard, change the situation before the enemy could react. But this time, the stakes had been different. It wasn't about reputation. It wasn't about potential. It was about survival, of entire units, of the Allied position, perhaps even of the timeline of the war itself. And Patton delivered. For Eisenhower, this was the final confirmation. All the risks, all the controversies, every difficult decision to keep Patton in command, despite the problems he caused, they all led to moments like this. Moments where no one else could act as quickly, think as aggressively, execute as decisively. Patton was never easy to manage. He was unpredictable, demanding, often controversial. But in the moments that mattered most, he was exactly what the war required. Not a perfect commander, but the right one. And in the end, that's why Eisenhower trusted him. Not because he ignored the flaws, but because he understood the cost of not using him. Because sometimes in war, victory doesn't go to the safest choice. It goes to the one willing to take the risk.